ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our today's Brownbag-Session. Today, we warmly welcome Ms. Nikoleta Jones. She's an associate professor at the Institute for Global Sustainable Development at the University of Warwick in the UK. And today, she's talking about the designation of effective protected areas and how they contribute both to ecological and socio-economic targets. Thank you, Nikoleta, for being our guest. And the question for you today is, do boundaries of protected areas contribute to their social effectiveness? We're looking forward to your answers, and the floor is yours, Nikoleta.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, it's very exciting, you know, to read about your work, and perhaps one day we can meet in person as well. So yeah, I'm based at the University of Warwick, and I'm an environmental social scientist. I do a lot of things around public acceptance for environmental policies, like making space for nature or making space for water. And today I'm going to focus on protected areas, which is what I mainly researched the last 5-6 years. So I will share my screen, or I'll try. I have prepared a short presentation. I hope you can see it. So what I'm going to discuss today, it's a collaborative work. That's why I added a few more people in the, in the presentation, because this is quite a large project, so I'm not on my own. So I'm going to discuss first a little bit, the context about protected areas in Europe, and then about their social impacts. And finally, I'm going to go into this question that Monica mentioned, the spatial distribution of impacts within protected areas. So the next decade is quite ambitious, and I think exactly your university is working towards these targets, let's say. We have the UN ecosystem restoration decade, and also all these new declarations from the EU about biodiversity, the new EU, the Green Deal. It's quite ambitious because they promote this idea that we will try to protect 30% of land and 30% of water by 2030. And in terms of land, it's a target which potentially could be achieved, but in terms of water, it's quite an ambitious target. So I have added here a designation about protected areas. I'm sure most of you are aware of that the protected area is a clearly defined geographical space, recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem services and cultural values. So the key point for me in this definition is that it's what it says, it's a clearly defined geographical space. So when a protected area is designated, this is mainly done based on ecological criteria. What kind of species we would like to protect, and these are the boundaries we basically create. So a lot of my work has to do, it's a lot about what these boundaries mean for local communities. So looking beyond the ecological effectiveness of protected areas. So in Europe, we are considered to be, the region with the most protected areas than any other region of the world in proportion. But the truth is 90% of them are less than 1,000 hectares, so they're quite small. We have a number of designations that overlap, like the Natura 2000 framework, the Ramsar Convention, the Emerald Network. We have the national parks, the regional parks, nature reserves. So it's a very complicated, let's say, mosaic of designations that often overlap and makes management and governance extremely challenging. And then we have the new EU biodiversity strategy. So we expect these protected areas to significantly increase in the European region, especially with marine protected areas. And a key argument and target behind these new policies is that we need to make more space for nature. So there's a lot of discussion around ecosystem restoration, rewilding, nature-based solutions. And it will be very interesting to see how these kind of initiatives will impact local communities in the future. When we look at social aspects of protected areas, the literature in general has picked up quite a lot in terms of the social impacts of these protected areas. So the last decade, we have seen an increase of publications about, how these protected areas benefit local communities, but also the kind of problems they create, for example, conflicts. So when we looked at the number of studies that have been published in Europe, we identified, let's say, 8 main categories of impacts. 7 of them are kind of standing on their own, and 1 of them is cutting across all themes. So one of them is about, how they impact access to natural resources for local communities. For example, if a community, uses wood from the local wood to heat their home, then by designating a protected area, you restrict this kind of access. Then the impact on livelihood, impact on health, impact on well-being, the local culture, connecting to nature, social relations, which relates a lot to the fact that often we have conflicts between, let's say, visitors and locals, or even between locals, but also a protected area might increase engagement of local communities, so it might actually benefit social relations. And cutting across all these themes, we have this kind of social equity topic, which means that these impacts exist, but we should also consider how they are distributed across different stakeholders. So someone, for example, who works in the tourism sector and lives near a very popular protected area often benefits from a financial point of view. But then other parts of the community might feel like that the protected area has started to become a burden because they have too many visitors. So, there's more traffic, and in general, they feel like the way they connected to nature has been disturbed. So very briefly, for example, to say that 42% of the studies we reviewed focused on the positive impact on well-being, 32 captured an impact on livelihood, 24% on culture. But apart from these percentages, what I wanted to emphasize that there is the other side, let's say, of the coin, that we have studies that have emphasized the negative impact. So for example, almost 20% of studies emphasize this kind of unequal distribution of impact, 16% the negative impact on human rights, 16% on social relations. So when we try to categorize the different impacts, there's never a black and white picture. It's a very mixed picture. So something that is beneficial for one community might be negative for another one. So coming now to the project we discussed in the beginning of the session. So I lead the project funded by the European Research Council, which is called Fidelio. The full title is Forecasting Social Impacts of Biodiversity Conservation Policies in Europe. The aim of the project is to capture social impacts of protected areas, to explore how these impacts are distributed in space and understand how perceptions about these impacts change through time. And we have also developed a tool, which is about social impact assessment tool for protected areas. And we have applied this tool in a number of protected areas that you see on the right-hand side of the slide. We don't have a case study in Austria, but we will be keen to explore, collaborations. Today, I'm going to focus just on 4 protected areas, surveys that were conducted between 2019 and 2021. Obviously, because of COVID, these surveys initially were done all face-to-face with local communities, but then we had to revert to online versions. So we sent postcards to a random sample of households to go online and fill in a questionnaire. The sampling frame in this case was about 50,000 and the final sample was about 1,200. And we used this tool, the SOCIA tool as we call, which is a social impact assessment tool for protected areas. The key questions that we were trying to answer through these surveys, what is the level of support for these protected areas? What are the main perceived social impacts by locals? And which factors influence perceived impact. So is it demographics? Is it an individual's personal values, their subjective well-being, trust in institutions? So we tested 19 indicators to see what influences basically their perception of impacts. And finally, how are social impacts distributed in space? So these are the four research areas that I was referring. One of them is the Peak District National Park in the UK. It's quite an established park, almost 50 years. The Eiffel National Park, which is in Germany, but very close to the border with Brussels, is an both of them extremely popular park with a lot of visitors. Then the Pieniny National Park in Slovakia, near the border with Poland. And finally, Prespes National Park in Greece. So they're all terrestrial. Only in Prespes we have a lake in the middle of the park. So they can be compared to some extent, although obviously they represent very different socio-ecological systems. And just from a methodological point of view, when we were capturing social impacts of that people perceive from the protected area, we were trying to assess, whether the spatial components influence their perception. So we tried to explore whether communities living together tend to give similar answers. Then we explored whether the location of the individual from the border of the protected area influence their perceptions. And this distance was captured like a straight line or driving distance or driving time, because obviously, especially in protected areas, often, reaching from one point to the other might be challenging for certain locations because it might be quite remote with very small roads. So if we look at the maps, okay, obviously it's difficult if one doesn't know the areas, but the main idea behind these maps is the darker the color you see, the more positive is the perception about the impact. So in this specific slide, I present the perception of people in terms of income, the impact of income of the protected area. And this was measured in a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 was the highest, the most beneficial, let's say, impact, and 1 was the least benefit, or we can say cost. The way the analysis is done, it creates for every park different categories. That's why you see here, for example, in Prespes, it divided, from 2.5 to 2.75, because this is how the sample was and this how the data was. But in general, the idea is that what we see is that when we divide the protected area in different municipalities, we see a significant difference. So we don't see a similar pattern across its park, so it doesn't have the same color. We see significant differences between locations on how people perceive impact. So to give an example, we see here the big district. So these are the boundaries of the park. And we see the closer you are to the boundaries, the more darker is the color. And this means that people who live close to the boundaries, but not necessarily inside the boundaries, are in this specific case, they perceive higher benefits. When we look at the spatial distribution of impact on quality of life, again, we see that, the perceptions of people are not, the impacts are not evenly distributed. So we see a lot of differences on the average, on the mean, basically, of every area. So that means that there is an issue here of what I call the spatial social equity in these protected areas. So the final question we wanted to answer is, okay, so what determines social impacts? So we explored both spatial aspects but also social aspects, and we saw that, for example, place attachment was the most important indicator along with subjective well-being. So the more attached someone is in a protected area, the more benefits they see from it. The other very interesting finding is that impacts differ depending on location. how close you are to the border of the protected area influences how you perceive the impact. But what was a very interesting finding, probably the most interesting, is that we saw a lot of spatial correlations depending on who you lived near. So the closer people tended to be together when they had negative perceptions of the protected area. So the main, let's say, conclusions that have come up from this research is that we see a lot of benefits which are connected with social aspects, income. So the impact on financial aspects, like impact on livelihood and impact and income, are not as important for local communities. It seems like that they benefit more from a social point of view rather from an economic point of view. And then to close by answering the question that Monica asked in the beginning, you know, do borders basically matter for the social effectiveness of protected area? Our results show that proximity of respondent is the most important determinant of perceived social impact when compared to all spatial measures. So it's not so much the distance from the border, but it's more who you live near with and what kind of perceptions they have. The other thing is that impacts are not limited only within the protected area border, but it seems like there's a flow of impacts, benefits or costs outside of the protected area. So from a social point of view, borders don't actually matter. In several cases, we see communities outside the protected area that benefit more compared to the areas that are inside. And a possible explanation is that these areas kind of have, you know, they have all the benefits, but they don't have the restrictions that come with a protected area designations. So our study highlights that there's a need to not only consider how impacts are distributed across different stakeholders when we designate a protected area, but also to consider how these impacts are distributed within the geographical area. So the designation should not be geographical only from an ecological point of view, but it should also consider, you know, how it will affect the communities within the boundaries and beyond that. And I've put here my email and the project's email in case you'd like to find out more. And if you search Fidelio, Warwick, and Cambridge University, you will find more details there. Thank you.
Will ensure nature conservation in the 21st century. Be part of the new 4-semester part-time master programme. Carinthia University of Applied Sciences.